My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'll never forget the sound of my sister's laughter echoing through grandfather's study that cold November afternoon. The rain was tapping against the tall windows of our family estate in the West Hills, and the fire in the stone fireplace cast dancing shadows across the mahogany bookshelves. Rebecca sat in grandfather's favorite leather chair, her manicured fingers wrapped around a crystal tumbler of his expensive bourbon, acting as if she'd already claimed ownership of everything in the room. The family lawyer, Mr. Harrison Blake, had just finished reading the will, and according to every word he'd spoken, I had been left with absolutely nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Well, that settles it then, Rebecca said, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she swirled the amber liquid in her glass. I guess grandfather finally saw things clearly in the end. She didn't even try to hide the smugness in her tone. Our parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, sat on the burgundy sofa, their faces carefully neutral, but their relief was obvious. They'd always worried that grandfather's soft spot for me might complicate their plans for the family legacy. The Mitchell Automotive Group had been grandfather William's life work, built from a single used car lot into 3 thriving dealerships across Portland. The family home, the vacation properties, the investment portfolios, the business shares, everything now belonged to Rebecca, the responsible older daughter who'd married well and never questioned the family's decisions. I was 28 years old, sitting in a room worth millions, and according to the legal document that had just been read aloud, I didn't deserve a single penny of it. Mr. Blake adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began organizing the papers on grandfather's massive oak desk. The surface was polished to a mirror shine, just as it had been every day of my childhood when I'd sit across from grandfather while he taught me about engines and business and the importance of treating people fairly. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who'd been naive enough to believe that love and time spent together mattered more than appearances and expectations. Sarah receives the sum of $5,000, Mr. Blake had said earlier, his voice matter-of-fact as if he were reading a grocery list instead of dividing up a man's entire life. To be used for educational purposes or personal betterment as she sees fit, $5,000. Rebecca would inherit millions, and I got what amounted to a scholarship fund. The insult was precise and calculated, just enough to avoid looking completely heartless, but nowhere near enough to matter. I watched my sister stand and walk to the window, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She gazed out at the sprawling grounds where we'd played as children, but I could tell she was already mentally redecorating, already planning how to reshape everything to match her vision of what the Mitchell legacy should look like. David, her fiancé, sat quietly in the corner, occasionally nodding along to whatever Rebecca said, his role as supportive future son-in-law performed with practiced ease. I have to say, Rebecca continued, turning back to face the room, I'm glad grandfather came to his senses. Some people just aren't cut out for this kind of responsibility. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I saw the flash of triumph there, the satisfaction of someone who'd finally received the official confirmation that she was the chosen one. It wasn't enough that she'd always been the favorite. It wasn't enough that she'd married into another wealthy family and lived the exact life our parents had mapped out for her. She needed this moment, needed to see me reduced to nothing in the place where I'd once felt most at home. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded in my lap. Years of being the family disappointment had taught me the value of composure, of never giving them the reaction they expected. They wanted tears or anger or pleading, they wanted me to fight for scraps, to beg for reconsideration, to prove their point about my lack of dignity and grace. Instead, I sat quietly and let their words wash over me like rain against glass. The business shares transfer immediately, Mr. Blake explained, shuffling through another set of documents, as do the properties and investment accounts. There are some tax implications we'll need to discuss, but overall it's a very straightforward distribution. He glanced at me with what might have been sympathy, or possibly just professional obligation. Miss Sarah, if you have any questions about your inheritance, or if you'd like me to explain how the educational fund will be administered, no questions. I said quietly, my voice steady. I understand perfectly. My father Robert cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. He was a tall man with graying temples and the kind of presence that commanded attention in business meetings, but in this room, surrounded by his father's things, he looked smaller somehow. Sarah, you know this isn't personal. Grandfather had to think about what was best for the family business, for the legacy he'd built. Rebecca has the experience, the stability, the husband, my mother Linda added with a thin smile. She was elegant as always, her silver hair perfectly styled, her pearls catching the firelight. A family business needs a family to run it properly. These things require careful planning, dear. I nodded slowly, as if I agreed with their reasoning, as if their logic made perfect sense. Of course Rebecca deserved everything. She'd followed every rule, met every expectation, lived every moment of her life according to the blueprint they'd drawn for her. She'd married David Coleman, whose family owned a successful construction company, creating the kind of business alliance that our parents had dreamed about. She'd never questioned their decisions, never disappointed them with unexpected choices or inconvenient dreams. And me? I'd been the problem child, the one who'd asked too many questions, spent too much time in grandfather's workshop learning about engines instead of learning about social graces. I'd chosen to study environmental science instead of business, had dated artists and musicians instead of potential business partners, had spent my weekends hiking in the mountains instead of attending charity galas. I'd been a square peg in their round hole, and now they had the legal documentation to prove that my differences made me unworthy of the family fortune. Rebecca finished her bourbon and set the empty glass down on grandfather's desk with a soft clink. I suppose we should start talking about transition plans, she said, her tone becoming businesslike. I'll want to meet with the dealership managers next week, review all the current contracts and vendor relationships. David has some ideas about expansion opportunities that might be worth exploring. I watched her take control of the conversation, already slipping into the role of family matriarch with the ease of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. She talked about quarterly reports and marketing strategies, about updating the showrooms and potentially acquiring a fourth location. She spoke with confidence and authority, using the business terminology she'd learned during her MBA program, the degree our parents had insisted she pursue while I was off studying soil contamination and watershed management. The rain against the windows grew heavier, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 4 o'clock. I thought about grandfather's hands teaching mine how to change oil, how to read the symptoms of an engine in distress, how to treat a customer with respect regardless of how much money they had in their pocket. He believed in hard work and fairness, in earning trust through honest dealing and standing behind your word. Those lessons felt far away now, buried under.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Legal language and family politics. We should probably discuss the timeline for the house as well, Rebecca continued, glancing around the study as if she were already measuring it for new furniture. I know David and I will eventually want to make some changes, modernize a few things. The guest wing could probably be converted into office space, and that old workshop behind the garage is just taking up valuable square footage. The workshop. The place where grandfather had spent countless hours restoring classic cars, where he'd taught me that every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. I could picture him there, his sleeves rolled up, his weathered hands gentle with delicate engine parts, explaining how each component worked together to create something powerful and beautiful. Rebecca wanted to tear it down and turn it into square footage. I think that's enough planning for today, my father said, standing and straightening his suit jacket. We'll have plenty of time to work out the details. The important thing is that everything is settled now, nice and clean. He smiled at Rebecca with obvious pride, the expression he'd worn at her wedding, at her graduation, at every milestone that proved she was exactly the daughter he'd always wanted. Mr. Blake began packing his papers into his leather briefcase, the crisp sound of documents being organized filling the temporary silence. "I'll have all the transfer paperwork ready by early next week," he said. "Rebecca, if you could stop by my office on Tuesday, we can take care of the signatures and get everything officially filed." "Of course," Rebecca replied, already pulling out her phone to check her calendar. "Should I bring David, or can we handle the business transfers separately from the personal assets?" As they discussed schedules and appointments, I stood quietly and walked to the bookshelf where grandfather had kept his collection of automotive history books. My fingers traced the worn spines, remembering how he'd pull down volume after volume to show me pictures of the classic cars he'd worked on in his younger days, the stories behind each restoration project, the pride he'd taken in bringing something broken back to perfect condition. "Sarah," my mother's voice cut through my reverie, "you're welcome to take a few of those books if you'd like, as mementos." The offer was meant to sound generous, but it landed like a slap. Mementos. As if my relationship with grandfather could be reduced to a few dusty books, as if 30 years of shared conversations and weekend adventures could be adequately commemorated with whatever scraps they were willing to let me carry away. "That's very kind," I said, turning back to face them. "But I think I'll pass." Rebecca looked up from her phone surprised. "Really? I thought you'd want something to remember him by." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Remember him by. As if I could ever forget the man who'd been more of a parent to me than the people standing in this room, who'd listened to my dreams and encouraged my questions and never once made me feel like I needed to be different to be worthy of love. But explaining that would require admitting how much this hurt, how much their casual dismissal of my grief felt like losing him all over again. "I have my memories," I said simply. "That's enough." The room fell quiet except for the continued patter of rain against the windows and the soft crackling of the fire. Mr. Blake closed his briefcase with a decisive snap and checked his watch. "Well, if there's nothing else, I should be getting back to the office. Weather's getting worse, and the roads in the hills can be tricky when it's this wet." He shook hands with my parents, nodded politely to David, and spent an extra moment with Rebecca congratulating her on her inheritance and promising to make the transition as smooth as possible. When he turned to me, his expression was carefully professional, but I caught something else there, a flicker of something that might have been regret. "Miss Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions about the educational fund, or if there's anything else I can help you with." I shook his hand and smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Blake, I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should." Something in my tone made him pause, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to read between the lines of my words. But then Rebecca was asking him about property tax implications, and the moment passed. He gathered his coat and briefcase and headed for the door, leaving our family alone in the study that no longer felt like it belonged to any of us. "Well," my father said, clapping his hands together with the satisfaction of a man who'd just checked an important item off his to-do list, "I think we should celebrate. Linda, why don't you call the River Terrace and see if they can accommodate us for dinner tonight? We should mark the occasion properly." "What a lovely idea," my mother agreed, already reaching for her purse. "Rebecca, you and David should join us, of course. We can discuss your plans for the business over a nice meal." I watched them make their arrangements, listened to them talk about their celebration dinner as if I weren't standing 3 feet away. It was perfectly in character for them, this ability to move forward without acknowledging the wreckage they'd left behind. They'd gotten what they wanted, achieved the outcome they'd been maneuvering toward for years, and now they could relax and enjoy their victory. "I should be going," I said, walking toward the door. "It's getting late, and the weather really is getting worse." "Oh, Sarah," my mother called after me, "you're welcome to join us for dinner if you'd like. I'm sure we could add another place setting." The invitation was offered with the kind of casual afterthought that made it clear how little my presence mattered to their celebration. They were going to toast Rebecca's inheritance and plan her future, and I could tag along if I wanted to watch. The generous offer of the grieving granddaughter, allowed to observe while her sister claimed everything their grandfather had built. "Thank you, but I have other plans," I said, not bothering to elaborate on what those plans might be. Rebecca looked up from her phone again. her expression curious. "Other plans, Sarah? You know you don't have to pretend everything's fine. This has to be difficult. And if you need some time to process, I'm processing just fine," I assured her, pulling on my coat. It was an old wool pea coat that had seen better days, nothing like the designer clothing that filled Rebecca's closet, but it was warm and practical, and it was mine. "Actually, I think this might be exactly what I needed." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, creating the kind of pause that suggested everyone was trying to figure out what I meant. But I didn't elaborate, didn't explain, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing confusion or curiosity in my expression. Instead, I simply said goodbye, and walked out of the room, leaving them to their celebration and their planning and their certainty that they'd finally put me in my proper place. The hallway outside grandfather's study was lined with family portraits, spanning 3 generations of Mitchells, all of them looking properly prosperous and respectable in their formal poses. I'd walked past these pictures thousands of times over the years, but tonight they felt different, like artifacts from someone else's life, reminders of a heritage that apparently didn't include me after all. I made my way to the front door, my footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged entryway. The house had always felt enormous to me as a child, full of hidden corners and secret passageways, but now it just felt empty and cold, like a museum dedicated to a family I'd never really belonged to anyway. Tomorrow, Rebecca would start making her changes, putting her stamp on everything, erasing the traces of the grandfather who'd loved me despite my failure to fit their mold. Outside, the November rain had intensified into a proper Pacific Northwest downpour, the kind that turned the streets into rivers and made driving treacherous for anyone who wasn't used to it. I stood under the covered porch for a moment, breathing in the clean cold air and letting the sound of the rain wash away the lingering echoes of Rebecca's laughter and my parents' careful explanations of why I didn't deserve a place in their legacy. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I pulled it out expecting to see something from a friend or maybe a work contact. Instead, it was from a number I didn't recognize, a simple message that made my heart skip a beat. "Miss Mitchell, this is Victoria Chen. We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? It's about your grandfather's will." I stared at the message for a long moment, rain drumming against the porch roof above me, trying to make sense of who Victoria Chen might be and why she thought we needed to talk about a will that had already been read and settled. But even as I wondered about the practical details, I felt something shift inside me, a tiny spark of possibility in what had seemed like a completely closed door. I typed back quickly, "What time and where?" The response came almost immediately, "Grind coffee. Near the courthouse, 8 a.m. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and pulled my coat tighter against the wind. Behind me, through the tall windows of the study, I could see my family still gathered around grandfather's desk, probably already planning how to divide up his personal effects and decide what to do with his vintage car collection. They looked satisfied, comfortable, secure in their victory and their vision of the future. But as I walked to my car through the pelting rain, I found myself thinking about grandfather's favorite saying, something he'd repeated whenever I got discouraged about a difficult repair or a complicated problem. "Sarah, girl, the thing about engines is that they're full of surprises. Just when you think you understand how everything works, you find a part you didn't know was there." Tomorrow morning, I was going to find out what Victoria Chen knew about parts that nobody else had noticed, and something told me that my family's celebration might be just a little premature. Parts 2, 5. The truth begins to unfold. I barely slept that night. My small studio apartment in the Arts District felt even more cramped than usual as I paced between the kitchenette and the single window that looked out onto the narrow alley behind the building. The rain had continued through the night, creating a steady rhythm against the glass that should have been soothing, but instead seemed to amplify every anxious thought racing through my mind. Who was Victoria Chen? What could she possibly know about grandfather's will that Mr. Blake didn't? And why had she contacted me specifically, rather than the family lawyer who'd handled the entire estate? The coffee shop she'd chosen was familiar to me. Grind Coffee sat in a converted warehouse space near the Multnomah County Courthouse, the kind of place that served serious coffee to lawyers and clerks and anyone else who needed caffeine to fuel their battles with the legal system. I'd been there before, usually when I had to handle some mundane business like renewing my driver's license or dealing with parking tickets. It wasn't the sort of place you'd expect to have a conversation that might change your life, but then again, the most important moments rarely announced themselves with fanfare. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of nervousness and partly because I'd given up on any pretense of sleep around 5 in the morning. The coffee shop was already busy with the early morning crowd, the air thick with the smell of espresso and the low murmur of conversations that people didn't want overheard. I ordered a large coffee, black, and found a table in the back corner where I could watch the door and try to figure out which of the incoming customers might be Victoria Chen. At exactly 8 o'clock, a woman in her 40s walked through the door, scanning the room with the purposeful gaze of someone who was looking for a specific person. She was Asian American, with short black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a dark blue suit that looked expensive but not flashy, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who spent her days dealing with complicated legal matters. When her eyes met mine across the crowded coffee shop, I knew immediately that this was the woman who'd sent me the cryptic text message. She approached my table with measured steps, her expression serious but not unkind. "Sarah Mitchell," she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Chen. Thank you for meeting me on such short notice." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way she looked directly into my eyes when she spoke. "Miss Chen, I have to admit, your message last night caught me off guard. What exactly is this about?" She gestured to the empty chair across from me. "May I sit? This conversation is going to take a while, and I'd prefer to have it somewhere we won't be overheard." She glanced around at the other patrons, then back to me. "Actually, would you be willing to take a walk instead? There's a small park about 2 blocks from here. The rain has stopped, and I think we'd have more privacy." Something in her tone suggested that privacy was more than just a preference, it was a necessity. I grabbed my coffee and followed her out of the coffee shop, my curiosity now thoroughly aroused. Victoria Chen walked with purpose, leading me through the downtown streets with the familiarity of someone who spent a lot of time in this part of the city. We passed several office buildings and a few early morning joggers before arriving at a small pocket park tucked between 2 commercial buildings. The park consisted of a few benches, some carefully maintained flower beds, and a small fountain that provided just enough background noise to mask our conversation from any casual eavesdroppers. Victoria chose a bench that faced away from the street, positioning us so that anyone who wanted to listen would have to be obviously intrusive about it. "Miss Mitchell," she began, settling onto the bench and turning to face me directly. "I'm going to tell you something that's going to be difficult to believe, but I need you to listen carefully and try not to interrupt until I'm finished. Can you do that?" I nodded, my coffee growing cold in my hands as I focused entirely on her words. "I'm a lawyer," she continued, "but I don't work for Blake and Associates, and I wasn't involved in the probate proceedings for your grandfather's estate. What I am is William Mitchell's personal attorney, retained by him specifically to handle certain matters that he wanted kept separate from his general estate planning." The words hit me like a physical blow. Personal attorney. Grandfather had never mentioned having a separate lawyer, had never hinted that there were aspects of his legal affairs that were being handled outside the family's normal channels. Mr. Blake had been the Mitchell family lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to property transfers to estate planning. The idea that grandfather had been working with someone else, keeping secrets from the family, seemed impossible. "I can see you're confused," Victoria said, her voice gentle but firm. "That's understandable. Your grandfather was very careful about compartmentalizing different aspects of his legal needs. Blake handled the public-facing estate work, the documents that would eventually become part of the probate record. I handled the private matters, the arrangements he didn't want anyone else to know about until the time was right." "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victoria reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "3 months before he died, your grandfather came to my office with a very specific request. He wanted to create what's called a codicil to his will, an addendum that would modify certain aspects of his estate distribution. But he didn't want this codicil to be filed with his primary will, and he didn't want Blake to know about its existence. She opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the letterhead clearly visible even from where I sat. It was official legal documentation, complete with signatures and notary seals, and at the top of the page, in bold letters, were the words "Codicil to the last will and testament of William Robert Mitchell. This codicil," Victoria continued, "significantly alters the distribution of your grandfather's estate. It was written and executed in complete accordance with Oregon state law, properly witnessed and notarized, and it supersedes any conflicting provisions in his primary will." I stared at the document, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this might be real. "What does it say?" Victoria smiled, for the first time since we'd met, and there was something almost conspiratorial in her expression. "It says that while Rebecca Mitchell is indeed entitled to inherit the family business and the primary residence, there are several significant assets that were deliberately omitted from the will that Blake read yesterday, assets that your grandfather specifically designated for you." The park seemed to grow quiet around us, as if the entire city had paused to listen to her words. A jogger passed by on the path behind us, their footsteps muffled on the wet pavement, but I barely noticed. All of my attention was focused on the woman sitting beside me and the impossible thing she was telling me. "The most significant asset," Victoria said, pulling out another document, "is the Cascade Mountain Lodge. It's a 200-acre property about 90 minutes east of Portland, complete with a main lodge, several guest cabins, and substantial timber rights. Your grandfather purchased it privately about 15 years ago, but he never listed it as part of his general estate holdings. According to the codicil, it belongs to you free and clear." I felt like the world had tilted sideways. The Cascade Mountain Lodge. I'd never heard grandfather mention owning property in the mountains, had never seen any reference to it in the family's business discussions or casual conversations. How had he managed to keep something so significant completely secret? "There's more," Victoria said, seeming to read my thoughts. "The lodge property includes a substantial trust fund that he established specifically for its maintenance and operation. The trust contains approximately $2 million, invested conservatively to provide ongoing income for property taxes, upkeep, and improvements. $2 million. I tried to process the number, tried to understand what it meant in the context of my life and my future. Yesterday, I'd walked out of grandfather's study with a $5,000 educational fund and the knowledge that my family considered me unworthy of their legacy. Today, I was sitting in a downtown park learning that I'd inherited property and resources that dwarfed anything I'd ever imagined owning. But why? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Why would he keep this secret? Why not just include it in his regular will? Victoria's expression grew serious again. "Your grandfather was a very astute man, Miss Mitchell. He understood family dynamics better than most people give him credit for. He told me that he loved all of his family members, but he also recognized that some of them were motivated by money and status rather than genuine affection. He wanted to ensure that you received an inheritance that reflected his true feelings about you, not one that could be influenced or manipulated by family politics." She pulled out another document, this one containing several pages of handwritten text in grandfather's familiar, careful script. "He also left you a letter, to be delivered along with the codicil. He wanted you to understand his reasoning in his own words." I took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing immediately the fountain pen he'd always used for important correspondence and the distinctive way he formed his letters. The paper was expensive stationery, the kind he'd used for business communications, but the tone of the writing was personal and intimate. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the family has gathered to hear my will, and you've discovered that the official distribution doesn't match what you might have expected based on our relationship. Please don't despair, and please don't think for a moment that their reaction reflects my true feelings about you." I had to pause in my reading, blinking back tears that threatened to blur the words. Even from beyond the grave, grandfather's voice came through clearly, warm and caring and utterly familiar. The truth is, the letter continued, I've been planning this for several years, ever since it became clear to me that your parents and sister view the family legacy primarily as a financial asset rather than as a responsibility to honor the values that built it. I've watched you grow into a young woman who understands the importance of hard work, integrity, and treating people with respect, regardless of their economic status. These are the qualities that made our business successful in the first place, and they're the qualities I want to see preserved in the next generation. Victoria sat quietly while I read, occasionally sipping from her own coffee but never interrupting or rushing me. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, creating patches of golden light that moved across the park as the wind shifted the branches overhead. It was the kind of morning that grandfather would have loved, crisp and clear and full of possibility. The Cascade Mountain Lodge, the letter went on, has been my private retreat for the past 15 years, a place where I could go to think and plan and remember what was truly important. I've spent countless weekends there, walking the trails and sitting by the lake and imagining what it would be like to share it with someone who would appreciate it for the right reasons. I always imagined that person would be you. The letter went on to describe the property in detail, the hiking trails and the small lake and the workshop he'd built in one of the cabins where he could tinker with old engines just like he did at home. He wrote about his hope that I would use the place not just as a retreat, but as a foundation for whatever path my life took, whether that meant starting my own business or pursuing my environmental science interests or simply having a place to raise a family away from the pressures and expectations of the Mitchell name. Your inheritance is not just about money, he concluded, though there's enough of that to give you real choices about your future. It's about having a place in this world that's truly yours, that reflects your values and your dreams rather than someone else's vision of what your life should look like. I hope you'll use it well, and I hope you'll sometimes think of your old grandfather when you're sitting by the lake in the evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains. When I finished reading, I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Victoria waited patiently, understanding that this kind of information required time to process, that the shift from disappointment to possibility couldn't happen instantaneously. There's one more thing, she said eventually, pulling out a final document. The codicil includes specific instructions about how and when this inheritance should be revealed to the rest of your family. Your grandfather was very clear about this point. I looked up from the letter, curious about what other surprises might be contained in the legal documents. According to his wishes, Victoria continued, you have complete discretion about if and when to inform your family about this inheritance. He understood that revealing it immediately might create family conflict, but he also recognized that keeping it secret indefinitely might not be in your best interests. The choice is entirely yours. The implications of this began to sink in slowly. I could, if I chose, simply walk away from yesterday's humiliation and start building a life based on the resources grandfather had secretly provided. I could let Rebecca and my parents continue believing that they'd successfully marginalized me while I used my actual inheritance to create the kind of future I wanted. The idea was both liberating and slightly overwhelming. What happens next? I asked. Victoria smiled again, and this time there was something almost mischievous in her expression. That depends on what you want to happen. I can transfer the property deed and trust access to you immediately if you'd like to take possession right away. Or we can wait, let things settle with your family's celebration of their inheritance and handle the transfer more quietly. I thought about Rebecca's laughter echoing through grandfather's study, about my parents' careful explanations of why I didn't deserve a place in their legacy, about the dinner they were probably having right now to celebrate their successful maneuvering. They'd gotten exactly what they thought they wanted, and they'd managed to exclude me in the process. The question was whether I wanted them to know immediately that their victory was incomplete, or whether I preferred to let them enjoy their triumph a little longer before discovering their mistake. "I'd like to see the property first," I said finally. "Before I make any decisions about my family, I want to understand exactly what grandfather has given me." Victoria nodded approvingly. "I think that's very wise. I can drive you up there this afternoon if you'd like, show you around the property and explain how everything works. The lodge has been maintained by a local caretaker service, so it's in excellent condition and ready for immediate occupancy if you decide you want to move in." Move in. The phrase carried implications that I hadn't even begun to consider. I'd been living in my tiny studio apartment for 3 years, saving money and trying to build some kind of foundation for my future. The idea that I might suddenly have a 200-acre mountain retreat as an option seemed surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies or books. "There's something else you should know," Victoria said, her tone becoming more serious. "Your grandfather included specific provisions about the property's potential for development. The timber rights alone are worth a substantial amount of money, and there are opportunities for ecotourism or sustainable development projects that would align with your environmental science background. This isn't just a place to live. If you choose to be strategic about it, it could be the foundation for a significant business enterprise." Business enterprise. Environmental science. Sustainable development. Suddenly the inheritance wasn't just about having a place to retreat from my family's disappointment. It was about having the resources to pursue the kind of work I'd always dreamed about, the kind of projects that combined conservation with economic development in ways that benefited both the environment and the local community. I looked at Victoria Chen, this woman who'd appeared in my life like something out of a legal thriller, bearing news that seemed too good to be true. "Why did my grandfather choose you as his attorney for this? Why not handle it through Blake and Associates?" Her expression grew thoughtful. "He came to me because I specialize in estate planning for people who want to maintain privacy about certain aspects of their wealth. I've handled similar situations before, where family dynamics make traditional inheritance distribution problematic. Your grandfather researched me thoroughly before making contact, and he was very specific about wanting someone who understood the importance of discretion. And you think this codicil will hold up legally if my family challenges it?" "The documentation is ironclad," Victoria assured me. "Your grandfather was extremely careful about following proper legal procedures, and everything was witnessed and notarized according to Oregon state law. Blake and Associates will have to acknowledge its validity when it's presented to them, regardless of how they feel about its contents." I finished my coffee, which had long since grown cold, and stood up from the bench. The morning sun was fully up now, burning off the last of the rain clouds and promising a clear, bright day. Around us the city was fully awake, people hurrying to their jobs and their appointments and their carefully planned lives. But I felt like I was standing outside of all that normal activity, suspended in a moment that would determine everything that came after. "I'd like to see the property today," I said, "and I'd like to understand all of my options before I decide what to do about my family." Victoria stood as well, gathering her documents and closing her briefcase with the satisfied air of someone who'd successfully completed a difficult task. "I'll pick you up at your apartment at 1 o'clock. Dress for hiking. The trails around the property are beautiful, but they can be muddy after rain like we had last night." As we walked back toward the coffee shop where I'd left my car, I found myself thinking about time and timing, about the difference between what people see on the surface and what's actually happening underneath. Yesterday my family had celebrated what they thought was their complete victory over me, their successful elimination of an inconvenient family member who didn't fit their vision of the Mitchell legacy. They'd gone to bed satisfied, secure in their control of the family resources and confident that they'd finally put me in my proper place. But they'd made their plans based on incomplete information. They'd built their celebration on the assumption that Mr. Blake's reading of the will represented the complete truth about grandfather's intentions. They'd never imagined that there might be secrets, that the man they thought they understood so well might have been several steps ahead of them all along. Standing on the sidewalk outside Grind Coffee, watching Victoria Chen disappear into the morning crowd, I realized that I was facing the same choice that had confronted every protagonist in every story I'd ever loved: what to do when you suddenly discover that you have more power than anyone thought you had. I could use that power quietly, building my new life away from my family's influence and judgment. Or I could use it more dramatically, revealing their mistake and watching them grapple with the reality that they'd underestimated me completely. The decision didn't have to be made today, or even this week. But it did have to be made eventually, and the choice I made would determine not just my own future but the future of the family relationships that had shaped my entire life. As I drove back to my apartment to prepare for the trip to the mountains, I found myself wondering what grandfather would have advised, what he would have said about the best way to handle the gift he'd given me. But even as I wondered about his advice, I realized that the inheritance itself was his answer to that question. He'd given me the resources and the freedom to make my own choices, to build my own version of the Mitchell legacy rather than being forced to accept the one my family had designed for me. Whatever I decided to do next, it would be my decision made from a position of strength rather than weakness. And for the first time since sitting in that mahogany-paneled study yesterday afternoon, I found myself genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. Part 6, Mic 9. The Hidden Empire revealed. Victoria Chen arrived at my apartment building precisely at 1 o'clock, driving a dark green SUV that looked both expensive and practical. I'd spent the morning in a strange state of suspended animation, unable to concentrate on anything except the revelation that had turned my world upside down in the space of a single conversation. I'd tried to eat lunch, but found myself staring at the sandwich without taking a bite, my mind cycling through everything Victoria had told me and trying to understand how dramatically my circumstances had changed overnight. The drive to the Cascade Mountain Lodge took us east through increasingly rural landscape, past small towns and farms, and eventually into the foothills of the Cascade Range. Victoria proved to be an engaging travel companion, filling me in on details about the property that hadn't been covered in our earlier conversation. The lodge, she explained, had originally been built in the 1960s as a corporate retreat for a Portland-based timber company, but it had fallen into disrepair when the company went through financial difficulties in the early 2000s. Your grandfather bought it at auction for a fraction of what it would cost to build today, Victoria said as we wound through increasingly dense forest on a narrow mountain road. He saw potential that other buyers missed, partly because the property requires a certain vision to appreciate what it could become with proper investment and care. She told me about the improvements grandfather had made over the years, working with local contractors and craftsmen to restore the main lodge and upgrade the guest cabins while maintaining the rustic character that made the property special. He'd installed a solar power system that made the lodge largely energy independent, upgraded the well and septic systems to accommodate year-round occupancy, and created a network of hiking trails that showcased the property's natural beauty without damaging the ecosystem. He was very particular about sustainability, Victoria continued. Everything he did was designed to minimize environmental impact while maximizing the property's potential for generating income through ecotourism or educational programs. He often said that the best business models were the ones that improved the land rather than exploiting it. As we climbed higher into the mountains, I found myself thinking about all the weekends grandfather had supposedly spent visiting old friends, or taking care of business matters outside the city. I'd never questioned these absences, assuming they were just part of his active social life, but now I realized he'd been coming here to this secret retreat that none of us had known existed. The idea that he'd had an entire parallel life, complete with property and projects and long-term plans, seemed almost impossible to believe. Did he ever bring anyone else here? I asked. Family members or business associates? Victoria shook her head. Not as far as I know. He was very clear about wanting this to be a private space, somewhere he could go to think and plan without the distractions of his regular life. He did mention once that he hoped someday to share it with someone who would appreciate it properly, but I got the impression he never felt like he'd found the right person until he made the decision to leave it to you. The road we were following had narrowed to little more than a gravel track winding through tall Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Occasional clearings provided glimpses of distant peaks still capped with snow despite the late autumn season. The air through the open windows was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth and something indefinably wild that you never encountered in the city. Just around this next curve, Victoria said, downshifting as we approached a sharp turn. I think you're going to be surprised. She was right. As we rounded the bend, the forest opened into a large natural meadow dominated by a spectacular log structure that was part mountain lodge, part architectural masterpiece. The building was massive but somehow managed to look like it belonged in its setting, as if it had grown organically from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. The logs were weathered to a silvery gray color that blended perfectly with the surrounding trees, and the roofline followed the natural slope of the land in a way that made the entire structure seem both impressive and understated. "Oh my God," I whispered, staring at the building as Victoria parked in a gravel area that had been designed to look like a natural clearing. "This is incredible. Wait until you see the inside," Victoria said with obvious satisfaction. Your grandfather had very specific ideas about how a mountain retreat should feel. The front entrance opened into a soaring great room with exposed beam ceilings that must have been 30 feet high at the peak. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that provided panoramic views of the surrounding forest and mountains. The furniture was a perfect blend of rustic and comfortable, with leather sofas and handcrafted wooden tables that looked like they'd been made specifically for this space. Everything was spotlessly clean and perfectly maintained, as if grandfather had just stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. The caretaking service has been maintaining the property exactly as your grandfather left it, Victoria explained, leading me through the great room toward a hallway that branched off to the left. He was very specific about wanting everything kept in perfect condition, regardless of how often he was able to visit. The main lodge contained 6 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom and each decorated in a style that managed to be both luxurious and authentically rustic. The master suite occupied the entire second floor, with a private deck that overlooked a small lake I hadn't noticed from the front of the building. The other bedrooms were located on the main floor, along with a commercial-quality kitchen, a library lined with books about forestry and sustainable development, and an office that contained a desk I recognized as being similar to the one in grandfather's study at home. He did a lot of his long-term planning here, Victoria said, noticing my interest in the office. The property files are all in that cabinet if you want to review them later, but let me show you the rest of the buildings first. Outside the main lodge, a network of gravel paths led to various outbuildings scattered throughout the meadow and into the surrounding forest. There were 4 guest cabins, each capable of sleeping 4 to 6 people, a workshop that was larger and better equipped than the one behind grandfather's house in Portland, and what Victoria described as a conference center that could accommodate groups of up to 50 people for meetings or educational programs. Your grandfather had been developing plans for ecotourism and environmental education programs, Victoria explained as we walked between the buildings. He'd researched the market extensively and believed there was significant demand for high-quality retreat experiences that combined luxury accommodations with genuine environmental education. The workshop was where I felt grandfather's presence most strongly. The building contained every tool and piece of equipment that anyone could need for working with wood or metal, all of it meticulously organized and maintained. There were several classic cars in various stages of restoration, including a 1967 Mustang convertible that looked like it had been restored to better than original condition. On the workbench I found a notebook filled with grandfather's handwriting documenting his restoration projects and his thoughts about various mechanical problems he'd encountered. "He spent a lot of time in here," Victoria said softly. "I think it reminded him of his early days working on cars, before the business became more about management and less about the actual craft." At the far end of the meadow, a trail led down to the lake Victoria had mentioned. It was smaller than I'd expected but perfectly pristine, surrounded by tall trees and fed by a stream that cascaded down from the mountains above. A small dock extended into the water, with a canoe tied alongside and several comfortable chairs positioned to take advantage of the view. The entire scene looked like something from a wilderness magazine, the kind of place where wealthy people went to pretend they were roughing it while still enjoying every possible comfort. "The lake is stocked with trout," Victoria said, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for me to join her. "Your grandfather was an enthusiastic fisherman, though I think he was more interested in the excuse to sit by the water than in actually catching anything." I sat down beside her, trying to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a mountain retreat or a vacation home, it was a complete alternative life, a fully realized vision of what was possible when someone had the resources and the imagination to create exactly what they wanted. The property represented years of careful planning and significant financial investment, but more than that, it represented a set of values and priorities that were completely different from the ones that dominated my family's conversations about success and achievement. "How much is all of this worth?" I asked, waving my hand to encompass the lodge and the outbuildings and the pristine natural setting. Victoria smiled. "That's a complicated question. The property itself, including all the buildings and improvements, is probably worth somewhere between $4 and $6 million depending on market conditions. But the real value is in the potential for development and income generation. The ecotourism business plan your grandfather developed projects annual revenues of over $2 million once the operation is fully established. $2 million in annual revenue. The number was so far beyond anything I'd ever contemplated that it seemed almost abstract, like discussing the budget for a space program or the gross domestic product of a small country. I tried to imagine what it would mean to have that kind of income, what kinds of choices and opportunities it would create, what kinds of problems it would solve. "There's something else," Victoria continued, pulling out her phone and showing me a series of photographs. "These are pictures of similar properties that have been developed for ecotourism in other parts of the Pacific Northwest. Your grandfather studied these operations extensively and believed that the Cascade Mountain Lodge had several advantages that would make it even more successful." The photographs showed beautiful mountain retreats that looked similar to what we were sitting in, but with additional amenities like zip lines and guided hiking programs and outdoor adventure courses. Some of them had been featured in travel magazines as destination resorts for people who wanted to experience the wilderness without sacrificing luxury or comfort. The reviews and financial information Victoria showed me suggested that there was indeed a substantial market for this kind of experience, particularly among affluent urban professionals who wanted to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. "The closest comparable property is about 3 hours north of here," Victoria said, scrolling through information on her phone. "They charge $1,500 per night for their premium accommodations and they're booked solid from April through October. Your grandfather's business plan was more ambitious and more comprehensive than anything currently operating in this region. $1,500 per night." I tried to do the math in my head, calculating potential revenues and occupancy rates and wondering what it would be like to manage that kind of operation.
The business side of the opportunity was fascinating, but even more appealing was the idea of creating something that would bring people closer to the natural world while generating income that could support conservation and education programs. What would I need to do to make this work? I asked. If I decided I wanted to pursue the ecotourism development. Victoria's expression became more serious, shifting from tour guide mode to business advisor mode. That would require substantial additional investment, probably another $2 to $3 million for the kind of infrastructure and marketing that would be
necessary to compete at the highest level. It would also require a significant time commitment, probably 3 to 5 years of intensive development work before the operation would be generating the kind of revenues your grandfather projected. 3 to 5 years. $2 to $3 million in additional investment. The scope of the project was both exciting and intimidating, representing the kind of long-term commitment that would define the direction of my entire life. It wasn't the sort of decision that could be made impulsively, but it also wasn't the sort of opportunity that was likely to come along again. Of course, Victoria added, you don't have to pursue the development option at all. The property is perfectly suitable as a private retreat, and the existing trust fund is more than adequate to cover maintenance and operating expenses indefinitely. You could simply enjoy it as your grandfather did, as a place to escape from the pressures of normal life. We sat by the lake for another hour, watching the afternoon light shift across the water and discussing various possibilities for the property's future. Victoria had clearly spent a lot of time thinking about these options, and she was able to answer detailed questions about everything from zoning regulations to marketing strategies to the environmental impact assessments that would be required for any major development. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Victoria suggested that we head back to the main lodge for a final look around before driving back to Portland. I followed her up the trail from the lake, but my mind was already racing ahead to all the decisions that would need to be made in the coming days and weeks. The inheritance was simultaneously more generous and more complicated than anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just about receiving money or property, it was about choosing what kind of life I wanted to build and what kind of legacy I wanted to create. Inside the lodge, Victoria showed me the property management files that contained detailed information about every aspect of the operation. There were contractor contacts and maintenance schedules and financial projections and environmental impact studies. There were architectural drawings for proposed expansions and marketing materials for the ecotourism concept and correspondence with various government agencies about permits and regulations. The files represented years of careful planning and research, a comprehensive roadmap for anyone who wanted to take the property to the next level. Your grandfather was nothing if not thorough, Victoria said, watching me flip through folders full of detailed documentation. He wanted to ensure that whoever inherited this property would have everything they needed to make informed decisions about its future. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, I found something that made me catch my breath. It was a photo album filled with pictures of grandfather at the property over the years, documenting his restoration projects and his quiet enjoyment of the mountain retreat. The photographs showed him working in the shop, fishing from the dock, sitting by the fireplace with a book, standing proudly beside completed renovation projects. In every picture, he looked happier and more relaxed than I'd ever seen him in the formal family photographs that decorated the walls of the Portland house. He was truly himself here, Victoria said softly, looking over my shoulder at the photographs. I think that's what he wanted to give you, not just a property or a business opportunity, but a place where you could be truly yourself without worrying about other people's expectations or judgments. The drive back to Portland was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts as we wound down through the darkening forest toward the lights of the city. I found myself thinking about the contrast between the two worlds I'd experienced in the past 24 hours. Yesterday, I'd sat in my family's formal study, listening to them explain why I didn't deserve a place in their legacy. Today, I'd walked through a mountain paradise that had been created specifically for me by the grandfather who'd understood me better than anyone else in my life. What happens next? I asked as we reached the outskirts of Portland. Victoria glanced at me in the rearview mirror. That's entirely up to you. I can begin the property transfer process immediately if you're ready to take legal ownership, or we can wait while you think things through. I can also arrange for you to meet with the caretaking service and the various contractors who've been maintaining the property, so you can understand exactly what's involved in keeping everything running smoothly. And my family, when do they find out about this? Whenever you decide to tell them, Victoria replied. The codicil is completely valid and legally binding, but there's no requirement that it be revealed to anyone else until you choose to make it public. You could move to the mountains tomorrow and live there for years without anyone in your family knowing where you've gone or how you're supporting yourself. The idea of simply disappearing into the mountains was appealing in its simplicity, but I knew it wasn't a realistic long-term solution. Eventually, my family would want to know what had happened to me, and eventually, I would need to decide whether the relationships that had shaped my entire life were worth preserving or whether it was time to start fresh with people who could appreciate me for who I actually was. I think I need a few days to process all of this, I said as Victoria pulled up in front of my apartment building. Can I call you later this week once I've had time to think through the options? Of course, Victoria said, handing me a business card and a set of keys. These are for the lodge, in case you decide you want to go back up there before we talk again. The alarm code is written on the back of the card. I climbed out of the SUV and stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the lights in my tiny studio apartment. 24 hours ago, that cramped space had represented the extent of my independence, the small foothold I'd managed to establish in a world that seemed designed to minimize my importance. Now it looked like what it actually was, a temporary way station, a place to pause and gather strength before moving on to something larger and more meaningful. As Victoria drove away into the Portland night, I found myself thinking about choice and consequence, about the difference between the life that other people plan for you and the life you discover you're capable of building for yourself. Grandfather's inheritance wasn't just about money or property, it was about possibility, about having the resources and the freedom to pursue dreams that I'd never dared to take seriously. Standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, with the keys to a mountain paradise in my pocket and the knowledge that my family's celebration was based on incomplete information, I realized that tomorrow was going to be the first day of a completely different kind of life. The only question was whether I was ready to embrace that change or whether I needed more time to prepare for the magnitude of what lay ahead. But as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I found myself thinking about the photograph of grandfather sitting by the fireplace in the mountain lodge, the expression of complete contentment on his face as he read his book in the place he'd created for himself. For the first time in my life, I could imagine myself in a similar photograph, surrounded by the kind of peace and purpose that comes from living according to your own values, rather than trying to meet other people's expectations. The inheritance was more than generous, it was transformative, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already beginning to understand that my family's dismissal of me was about to become the best thing that had ever happened to me. The next morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent wrestling with life-changing decisions. I'd spent hours lying awake, alternating between excitement about the possibilities grandfather had given me and anxiety about the magnitude of the choices I now faced. By dawn, I'd reached a decision that surprised me with its simplicity. I was going to take ownership of the mountain property and begin exploring the eco-tourism development option. But I wasn't going to tell my family about any of it until I was ready to do so from a position of complete strength and independence. The first step was practical and immediate. I called in sick to my job at the environmental consulting firm, where I'd been working for the past 2 years, then drove back to the Arts District office where I'd been renting desk space for my freelance projects. I'd been building a small client base, doing environmental impact assessments for local businesses, work that was both meaningful and reasonably profitable, but limited by my lack of capital for expansion. Now suddenly, I had the resources to think much bigger. I spent the morning researching ecotourism operations throughout the Pacific Northwest, reading case studies and financial reports, and trying to understand what separated the successful ventures from the ones that had failed to achieve their potential. The market research grandfather had compiled was extensive and professionally done, but I wanted to supplement it with my own analysis based on my environmental science background and my understanding of current trends in sustainable tourism. By afternoon, I'd developed the outline of a plan that was both ambitious and achievable. The Cascade Mountain Lodge would be positioned as a premium destination for environmentally conscious travelers who wanted to experience the Pacific Northwest wilderness without compromising on comfort or educational value. The initial phase would focus on upgrading the existing accommodations and developing a core set of programs around wildlife observation, forest ecology, and sustainable living practices. Subsequent phases would add adventure activities like guided hiking expeditions, rock climbing instruction, and winter sports programs. The financial projections were encouraging but realistic. Based on comparable operations and current market conditions, I estimated that the lodge could generate annual revenues of $1.8 to $2 million once fully operational, with profit margins in the 30 to 40% range. The initial investment required would be substantial, but the long-term potential for both financial return and positive environmental impact made the project compelling from multiple perspectives. More importantly, developing the ecotourism operation would allow me to combine my professional expertise with my personal passion for environmental education and conservation. The lodge could become a model for sustainable tourism practices, demonstrating that it was possible to provide luxury experiences while actually improving rather than degrading the natural environment. It was the kind of project that could define my career and my legacy, the kind of work that would matter for decades to come. But even as I developed my business plan and calculated potential returns on investment, I found myself thinking about my family and the dinner they'd probably had the night before to celebrate Rebecca's inheritance. They'd made their toasts and their plans, secure in the knowledge that they'd successfully eliminated me from their version of the Mitchell legacy. They'd probably discussed Rebecca's ideas for modernizing the dealerships and expanding into new markets, confident that they finally had the family unity and shared vision that they'd always wanted. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they were celebrating their control over grandfather's business empire, I was planning to build something even more impressive, using resources they didn't know existed. They thought they'd won the game, but they'd been playing by rules that didn't account for all the pieces on the board. Grandfather had been more strategic than any of them had realized, and his real legacy was going to be developed by the granddaughter they'd dismissed as irrelevant. That evening, I drove back up to the Cascade Mountain Lodge, using the keys Victoria had given me and following the directions I'd memorized during our visit the day before. The property looked even more impressive in the late afternoon light, the log buildings warm and welcoming against the backdrop of forest and mountains. I let myself into the main lodge and spent several hours walking through the rooms, trying to imagine what it would be like to live there permanently, and to see the space filled with guests who'd come to experience the kind of connection with nature that grandfather had valued so highly. In the master suite, I found a small leather journal that contained more of grandfather's handwritten notes about his plans for the property. He documented his thinking about everything from the optimal number of guests for different types of programs to the best locations for additional hiking trails. The level of detail was remarkable, revealing not just his business acumen, but his genuine passion for creating something that would bring people closer to the natural world. One entry, dated just 3 months before his death, caught my attention. Sarah would understand what this place could become, he'd written.
She has the education and the values to do it right, to create something that serves both people and the environment, rather than exploiting either one. I just hope she'll have the confidence to think as big as the opportunity deserves. Reading those words, sitting in the house he'd built and prepared for me, I felt something shift inside me. The inheritance wasn't just about financial security, or even about having a beautiful place to live. It was about being entrusted with a vision that was larger than my own immediate needs, about being given the opportunity to create something that would outlast both grandfather and me. The responsibility was as significant as the opportunity, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge I'd been preparing for my entire professional life. I spent that night at the lodge, sleeping in the master bedroom, and waking to a view of the lake surrounded by morning mist. The silence was profound, broken only by bird songs and the distant sound of the stream that fed the lake. It was the kind of peace that made clear thinking possible, the kind of environment where important decisions could be made without the distractions and pressures that clouded judgment in the city. Over breakfast on the deck overlooking the lake, I made a series of phone calls that would begin the process of transforming my life. I called Victoria Chen to begin the property transfer process and to schedule meetings with the contractors and consultants who would be essential for developing the ecotourism operation. I called my landlord to give notice on my apartment, and I called my boss at the environmental consulting firm to submit my resignation, effective in 2 weeks. Each phone call felt like closing a door on one version of my life and opening another door that led toward possibilities I was just beginning to understand. By the time I finished my calls, I'd committed myself to a path that was both exciting and irreversible, a future that would be entirely of my own making rather than something shaped by other people's expectations and limitations. The 2-week notice period at my job passed quickly, filled with the countless details involved in wrapping up projects and transferring responsibilities to colleagues. I told my coworkers that I was pursuing a new opportunity in sustainable tourism development, which was true as far as it went, but I didn't mention the scale of the project or the resources that were making it possible. There would be time for detailed explanations later, after I'd proven that the concept was viable and sustainable. My family, meanwhile, continued to operate under the assumption that I was struggling to rebuild my life after being excluded from grandfather's will. Rebecca called once to check on me, her tone carefully sympathetic as she asked how I was handling the disappointment and whether I needed any help with immediate expenses. I thanked her for her concern and assured her that I was managing fine, that I'd found some new opportunities that were keeping me busy and optimistic about the future. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, though something in her voice suggested that my resilience was not entirely what she'd expected. "I know this whole situation has been difficult, but I really think it's going to work out for the best for everyone. You'll find your own path, and the family business will be in good hands." "I'm sure you're right," I replied, marveling at her ability to sound generous while subtly reinforcing her own superior position. Things have a way of working out exactly as they should. After I hung up, I realized that my conversation with Rebecca had crystallized something important for me. I no longer felt angry about their dismissal of me, or hurt by their assumption that I lacked the capability to build something significant on my own. Instead, I felt a quiet confidence that came from knowing something they didn't know, from understanding that their version of success was smaller and more limited than what I was about to create. The inheritance had given me more than property and financial resources. It had given me the freedom to discover what I was actually capable of achieving when I wasn't constrained by other people's limited vision of my potential. And as I prepared to move to the mountains and begin the most ambitious project of my life, I found myself looking forward to the moment when my family would finally understand what they'd missed, when they decided I wasn't worth including in their legacy. That moment was coming, though they didn't know it yet, and when it arrived, it was going to change everything they thought they understood about power and family and the difference between inheriting success and actually earning it. The final revelation: 3 months had passed since I'd moved to the Cascade Mountain Lodge, and the transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. Working with a team of local contractors and sustainable development specialists, I'd begun the first phase of converting the property into a premier ecotourism destination. The guest cabins had been upgraded with luxury amenities while maintaining their rustic charm. The main lodge had been equipped with state-of-the-art conference facilities, and we'd developed a comprehensive program of guided nature experiences that were already attracting attention from travel writers and environmental organizations. The business was exceeding even my most optimistic projections. We'd opened with a soft launch in February, hosting small groups of environmentally conscious travelers who were willing to brave the Pacific Northwest winter for a truly unique wilderness experience. Word of mouth had been extraordinary, and our spring bookings were completely sold out through the end of June. The combination of luxury accommodations, expert naturalist guides, and genuine commitment to environmental education had created exactly the kind of distinctive experience that affluent travelers were seeking. More importantly, the work was fulfilling in ways I'd never imagined possible. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities, from developing partnerships with local wildlife organizations to creating educational programs that would inspire guests to become advocates for conservation. I was using every aspect of my environmental science background while learning new skills in hospitality management, marketing, and sustainable business development. It was exactly the kind of career I'd dreamed about but never believed I'd have the opportunity to pursue. The financial success had been gratifying, but the personal transformation had been even more significant. Living at the lodge had given me a sense of peace and purpose that I'd never experienced before. I woke each morning to the sound of birds and the sight of mountains, spent my days working on projects that aligned perfectly with my values, and fell asleep each night with the satisfaction that came from building something meaningful and lasting. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. My family, meanwhile, had continued their lives in Portland, apparently unaware that anything had changed in my circumstances. I'd maintained minimal contact with them, responding politely to occasional texts from my mother and brief phone calls from Rebecca, but offering no details about my new life or my growing success. As far as they knew, I was still struggling to rebuild after being excluded from grandfather's inheritance, probably working some insignificant job and living in modest circumstances. The irony of the situation had become less amusing over time and more instructive. Their assumption that my worth as a person was directly tied to my access to family money revealed something fundamental about their values and their understanding of success. They'd celebrated what they thought was their victory over me, but they'd never bothered to find out what I was actually capable of achieving when I had the resources and freedom to pursue my own vision. That was about to change. The catalyst came in the form of an unexpected phone call from my mother on a bright Thursday morning in late May. I was reviewing applications for our summer naturalist program when her name appeared on my phone screen, and something in the timing made me suspect that this wasn't going to be one of our usual brief check-ins. "Sarah dear," she began, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tone she used when she was about to deliver news that she thought might be sensitive. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I replied, setting aside the applications and walking out onto the deck that overlooked the lake. "What can I do for you?" "Well, it's about Rebecca's wedding," she said, and I could hear the rustle of papers in the background, suggesting that she was working from some kind of list or schedule. "The ceremony is next month, as you know, and we've been finalizing all the arrangements. The thing is, Rebecca has decided she'd like to have the reception at a very special venue, somewhere that would really make the event memorable." I had a sudden intuition about where this conversation was headed, and I found myself smiling as I waited for her to continue. "She's found this absolutely beautiful mountain lodge about 90 minutes from Portland," my mother went on, her enthusiasm building as she described the venue. "It's called the Cascade Mountain Lodge, and it's supposed to be one of the most exclusive ecotourism destinations in the Pacific Northwest. The photographs are stunning, and the reviews are incredible, but the booking fees are quite substantial." The booking fees were indeed substantial. I'd set our rates at the premium end of the market, positioning the lodge as a luxury destination for discerning travelers who valued both comfort and environmental responsibility. Our wedding packages, in particular, were priced to reflect the exclusivity of the experience and the comprehensive service we provided. The thing is, my mother continued, when Rebecca contacted them about availability, they told her they were completely booked through the end of the year. Apparently, they only accept a very limited number of events, and they're extremely selective about their clients, but Rebecca is absolutely determined to have her reception there, and your father thinks that perhaps some of our business connections might be able to help us secure a booking. I leaned against the deck railing, watching a family of deer graze in the meadow below, while I considered how to respond. The opportunity that was presenting itself was almost too perfect to believe, but it also required careful handling to achieve maximum impact. That does sound like a beautiful venue, I said carefully. What exactly are you hoping I might be able to do to help? Well, we know you've been working in environmental consulting, my mother said, and we thought perhaps you might have some connections in the sustainable tourism industry, maybe someone who could put in a good word for us, or help us understand how to approach the lodge management more effectively. The suggestion that I might have useful professional connections was the first indication that my family was beginning to recognize that I'd built some kind of life for myself outside their sphere of influence. It was a small acknowledgement, but it represented a significant shift from their previous assumption that I was struggling to survive without their support. I might be able to help, I said, allowing a note of thoughtful consideration to enter my voice. Let me make some inquiries and see what I can find out. Can you send me the contact information for the lodge, and maybe some details about what Rebecca is looking for in terms of dates and guest count? Oh Sarah, that would be wonderful, my mother said, and I could hear genuine relief in her voice. Rebecca will be so grateful, and I know this would mean a great deal to the whole family. Let me send you all the information right now. After we hung up, I sat on the deck for a long time, watching the afternoon light shift across the lake and thinking about the extraordinary set of circumstances that had just aligned. My sister wanted to have her wedding reception at the property I owned, the business I'd built, the success story that none of them knew existed. They were asking for my help to access something that was entirely mine, while continuing to operate under the assumption that I was a peripheral figure in their world. The temptation to reveal the truth immediately was strong, but I recognized that this situation offered an opportunity for something much more satisfying than a simple dramatic revelation. If I handled things carefully, I could orchestrate a moment
that would not only expose their mistake about my capabilities, but also demonstrate the full scope of what I'd accomplished while they were celebrating what they thought was my marginalization. I spent the rest of the afternoon developing a plan that was both elegant and psychologically sophisticated. Rather than simply telling my family that I owned the lodge, I would allow them to go through the entire process of trying to secure a booking. Let them experience the reality of their limitations and their need for my assistance, and then reveal the truth at the moment when it would have maximum impact on their understanding of our respective positions. The first step was to call Victoria Chen and explain the situation. As my attorney and the person who'd helped orchestrate the inheritance transfer, she would need to be involved in any scenario that brought my family into direct contact with my business interests. "This is quite a development," Victoria said after I'd outlined what had happened. "Are you sure you want to handle it this way? It would be much simpler to just tell them directly that you own the property." Simple? Yes, I agreed, but not nearly as educational. They need to understand not just that they were wrong about my capabilities, but that their entire framework for thinking about success and family relationships is fundamentally flawed. A simple revelation wouldn't accomplish that. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking through the legal and practical implications of what I was proposing. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "I want them to go through the normal booking process," I said. "Let them submit their application. Let them experience being evaluated like any other potential client. Let them understand what it means to be dependent on someone else's approval for something they want badly. Then when they're completely invested in the outcome, I'll reveal that the decision is mine to make." That's quite a psychological gambit, Victoria said though. I could hear a note of admiration in her voice. Your grandfather would probably approve. He always believed that the most important lessons were the ones that people had to discover for themselves. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched my family navigate the booking process with a mixture of amusement and genuine curiosity about their behavior. Rebecca had submitted a formal application that included detailed descriptions of her vision for the reception, financial documentation proving their ability to pay the substantial fees, and references from other vendors and venues who could vouch for their reliability as clients. The application was impressive, demonstrating both the scale of their wealth and their serious commitment to making the wedding a spectacular event. The guest list included over 200 people, many of them prominent figures in Portland's business and social communities. The proposed menu featured locally sourced organic ingredients and wine pairings that would showcase the best of Oregon's agricultural products. The decorating plans emphasized natural materials and seasonal flowers that would complement rather than compete with the lodge's mountain setting. I reviewed the application with the same professional objectivity I brought to all potential bookings, assessing their request against our standard criteria for environmental impact, cultural sensitivity, and alignment with our educational mission. By any objective measure, their event would be exactly the kind of high-profile, environmentally responsible celebration that enhanced our reputation and attracted future bookings from similar clients. But I also used the review process to gather intelligence about their current circumstances and their attitudes toward me. The application included a section where clients were asked to describe why they'd chosen the Cascade Mountain Lodge for their event, and Rebecca's response was revealing in its assumptions about luxury, exclusivity, and the kind of experience that validated her sense of social status. We're looking for a venue that reflects our family's commitment to environmental responsibility and our appreciation for the natural beauty of the Pacific Northwest, she'd written. The Cascade Mountain Lodge represents exactly the kind of exclusive, sustainable experience that we want to share with our closest friends and family members as we celebrate this important milestone in our lives. The language was perfectly crafted to appeal to our stated values, but it also revealed her understanding of the event as primarily about social positioning rather than genuine environmental commitment. She wanted the lodge because it was exclusive and expensive, because holding her reception there would send a message about her family's wealth and sophistication. The environmental aspects were secondary, something she mentioned because she knew it was expected rather than because it represented her genuine priorities. Meanwhile, my mother had been working her social connections, trying to find someone who might have influence with the lodge management or insight into the booking process. She'd contacted several people in Portland's environmental and tourism communities, asking for advice about how to approach what she described as this very exclusive eco-tourism operation that's become quite popular with the right sort of people. The phrase "the right sort of people" was particularly telling, revealing her assumption that access to the lodge was primarily about social connections rather than genuine interest in environmental education or sustainable tourism. She was approaching the booking as if it were a country club membership or a charity board appointment, something that required the right introductions and social credentials rather than alignment with our stated mission and values. Through mutual acquaintances in Portland's environmental consulting community, I learned that my father had also been making inquiries, using his business connections to try to understand the lodge's ownership structure and decision-making process. He'd apparently been frustrated by the lack of publicly available information about the property's management, which was intentional on my part, but which he interpreted as unnecessary secrecy from a business that should have been eager to accommodate clients of his stature. "It's the most unusual business model I've encountered," he'd reportedly told a colleague. "They seem to have more demand than they can handle, but they're not interested in expanding or maximizing revenue. It's almost like they're more concerned with some kind of ideological purity than with normal business considerations." His frustration was understandable but also illuminating. He was accustomed to a world where money and connections could solve almost any problem, where business relationships were primarily transactional, and where customer service meant accommodating the preferences of wealthy clients regardless of other considerations. The idea that a business might prioritize mission alignment over revenue maximization was genuinely foreign to his understanding of how the world worked. As the 2-week review period neared its end, I began receiving increasingly anxious phone calls from my mother, asking whether I'd been able to make any helpful connections or gather any useful information about the lodge's booking process. Her growing desperation was evident in her willingness to share details about their financial situation and their social connections, information that she would normally have kept private but which she now offered freely in the hope that it might somehow improve their chances of securing the booking. "Rebecca is really starting to worry that this isn't going to work out," she confided during one of these calls. "She's had her heart set on this venue ever since she saw the photographs, and she's already told several people about the location. It would be quite embarrassing if we had to choose somewhere else at this point." The fear of embarrassment was clearly a significant motivator for my family, perhaps even more powerful than their genuine desire for a beautiful wedding venue. They'd built their social identity around their ability to access exclusive experiences and premium services, and the possibility that they might be denied something they wanted was challenging their fundamental understanding of their place in the world. "I'm sure it will work out," I assured her. "But these things sometimes take time. Exclusive venues can afford to be selective about their clients, and they often have very specific criteria that aren't always obvious to outsiders." "What kind of criteria?" she asked, and I could hear her frantically taking notes. "Is there anything specific we should emphasize in our communications with them?" "Well," I said thoughtfully, "places like this are usually most interested in clients who genuinely understand and appreciate their mission rather than people who are just looking for an impressive venue. They want to work with families who share their values about environmental responsibility and sustainable living, not just people who can afford their fees." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her recalibrating her understanding of what might be required to secure the booking. The idea that money alone might not be sufficient was clearly a new concept for her, one that challenged her basic assumptions about how privilege and access functioned in the modern world. The day before I'd planned to announce my decision about their application, I received a call from Rebecca herself, her voice carrying a level of vulnerability that I'd rarely heard from her before. "Sarah," she began, "Mom told me you've been trying to help us with this mountain lodge situation, and I wanted to call and thank you personally. I know things have been difficult between our family lately, and the fact that you're willing to help me with my wedding despite everything that happened with grandfather's will means more to me than I can express." The apparent sincerity in her voice was surprising, and for a moment I wondered whether my plan was unnecessarily cruel, but then she continued, and her next words reminded me why this lesson was necessary. "I've been thinking about that day in grandfather's study," she said, "and I realized that maybe we didn't handle things as sensitively as we should have. I mean, I know you were probably hoping for more than you received, and it must have been disappointing to realize that grandfather saw our situations so differently." The condescension in her sympathy was breathtaking. Even in her moment of vulnerability, when she was asking for my help with something she wanted desperately, she couldn't resist reinforcing her superior position by expressing pity for my supposed disappointment. She was apologizing not for her family's treatment of me, but for my failure to understand why that treatment had been justified. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied carefully, "and I'm happy to help however I can. Family should support each other, especially during important moments like weddings." "Exactly," she said, her relief evident, "and Sarah, if this works out, if you're able to help us secure this booking, I want you to know that you'd always have a place at our family table. I know you've been struggling to find your direction since grandfather's death, but we're family, and family takes care of each other." The offer of a permanent place at their family table, contingent on my ability to solve their current problem, was the final confirmation that I needed about their fundamental inability to see me as anything other than a useful subordinate.
They were willing to tolerate my presence and even express gratitude for my assistance, but only within the context of a relationship where they held all the power and I existed to serve their needs. That evening, I sat in grandfather's favorite chair by the fireplace in the main lodge, reading through the business plan he'd developed for the ecotourism operation and thinking about the conversation with Rebecca. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the windows, the lake reflected the last light of the day. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, contemplative setting where important decisions should be made, where the noise and distractions of daily life fell away and allowed for clear thinking about what really mattered. Grandfather's business plan contained a section about the kind of clients the lodge should serve, and his criteria had nothing to do with wealth or social status. He'd written about wanting to attract people who were genuinely curious about the natural world, who approached the wilderness with humility and respect, rather than a desire to conquer or consume it. He'd envisioned educational programs that would inspire guests to become advocates for conservation, business practices that would model sustainable development principles, and a community of visitors who shared a commitment to environmental stewardship. My family's application met the technical requirements for booking the lodge, but it completely failed to demonstrate the kind of values alignment that grandfather had considered essential. They wanted to use the property as a backdrop for social theater, a way to impress their guests and validate their own sense of importance. The environmental aspects of our mission were peripheral to their interests, something they mentioned because they knew it was expected, but not something that genuinely motivated their desire to hold their event at the lodge. More troubling was their assumption that my assistance was valuable primarily because I might have useful connections, rather than because I might have developed genuine expertise in sustainable tourism or environmental education. Even when they were asking for my help, they couldn't imagine that I might have built something significant on my own, that my value might stem from my own accomplishments rather than my ability to access other people's achievements. The next morning, I called Victoria Chen to confirm the final details of our plan, then placed a call to Rebecca to schedule what I described as an important conversation about your lodge application. "You have news?" she asked immediately, her anxiety evident even over the phone. "I do," I said, "but it's the kind of conversation that should happen in person. Are you available this afternoon? I could drive down to Portland, or if you prefer, you could come up to the lodge property. I'm working on a project up here today, and it might be interesting for you to see the place you're hoping to book for your reception." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her calculating the implications of the different options. "You're at the lodge, how did you manage that?" "I'll explain everything when we meet," I said. "Should I expect you around 2 o'clock? The drive from Portland to the Cascade Mountain Lodge had never seemed longer to me than it did that afternoon, as I waited for my family to arrive and discover the truth about my circumstances. I'd prepared the lodge for their visit, ensuring that everything was perfect, that every detail reflected the level of success and sophistication I'd achieved. The guest cabins were pristine, the conference facilities were equipped with the latest technology, and the main lodge showcased the kind of luxury that could only be achieved through significant investment and careful attention to detail. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard the sound of cars coming up the gravel drive. From the window of the main lodge, I watched as 2 vehicles appeared through the trees, Rebecca's luxury SUV, followed by my parents' sedan. All 4 of them had come, apparently deciding that this conversation was important enough to warrant a family delegation. I walked out onto the front porch as they parked in the designated area, watching their faces as they took in their first direct view of the property. The expressions of surprise and appreciation were immediate and obvious. Even for people accustomed to luxury, the lodge was impressive, and the natural setting was spectacular. This was clearly not what they'd expected when I'd mentioned working on a project at the property. "Sarah," my mother called out as they approached the lodge, "this place is even more beautiful than the photographs. How did you manage to arrange a visit?" "Come inside," I said, leading them into the great room with its soaring ceilings and panoramic windows. "I think you'll find the interior even more impressive." For the next 20 minutes, I gave them a comprehensive tour of the facility, pointing out the features that made the lodge unique, and explaining the various amenities and services we provided. I described the educational programs, the guided nature experiences, and the sustainable practices that had earned us recognition from environmental organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. I showed them the guest accommodations, the conference facilities, and the outdoor activity areas that would be available for their reception. Throughout the tour, I watched their faces carefully, noting the growing confusion about my apparent expertise and access to the property. Rebecca asked increasingly pointed questions about my role and my relationship with the lodge management, clearly struggling to understand how I'd become so knowledgeable about an operation that was supposed to be extremely exclusive and secretive. "The person who's been coordinating your application process," I said finally, as we returned to the main lodge, asked me to handle this conversation personally. They thought it would be more appropriate for family members to discuss the situation directly rather than going through formal business channels. "The coordinator knows we're family?" my father asked, his surprise evident. "Oh yes," I said, settling into one of the leather chairs arranged around the massive stone fireplace. "They know exactly who you are, and they've been following your application very carefully. In fact, they've been quite interested in your family dynamics and your understanding of environmental responsibility." The four of them exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about what this meant for their application, but beginning to sense that the conversation was moving in an unexpected direction. "Sarah," Rebecca said, taking a seat across from me, "I need to ask you directly. What exactly is your connection to this place? How are you able to arrange tours and speak with such authority about their programs and policies?" I looked at each of them in turn, taking in their expensive clothing and their carefully maintained appearances, their obvious wealth, and their confidence in their ability to navigate any social or business situation. They were still operating under the assumption that the world worked according to rules they understood, that money and connections could solve any problem, that their position in Portland's social hierarchy guaranteed them access to whatever they wanted. "My connection to this place," I said quietly, "is that I own it." The silence that followed was profound and immediate. Rebecca's mouth fell open, my mother's hands flew to her pearls, my father's face went completely blank, and for a long moment, none of them seemed capable of processing what I'd just said. "You own it?" Rebecca whispered finally. "I own it," I confirmed. "The Cascade Mountain Lodge, all 200 acres, the buildings, the business, the staff, the programs, everything. It was left to me by grandfather, along with a trust fund of $1.2 million and detailed business plans for developing it into exactly what you see today." My father was the first to recover enough to speak. "That's impossible," he said, his voice hoarse. "We heard the will. Mr. Blake read every provision. You inherited $5,000 for educational purposes." "You heard one will," I corrected. "Mr. Blake read the document that was filed with the probate court, but grandfather also created a codicil, a legal addendum to his will, that specified additional bequests that weren't included in the public document. This property and its associated assets were transferred to me through that codicil, which is completely valid and legally binding." Victoria Chen chose that moment to enter the lodge, carrying her familiar briefcase, and wearing the same professional demeanor she'd maintained throughout our association. "Good afternoon," she said, nodding to each member of my family in turn. "I'm Victoria Chen, Miss Mitchell's attorney, and the person who handled the codicil execution on behalf of William Mitchell." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing copies of all the relevant legal documents. "If you'd like to review the paperwork," she said, handing the folder to my father, "you'll find that everything was properly executed according to Oregon state law, witnessed and notarized exactly as required." My father took the folder with shaking hands, scanning the documents while my mother read over his shoulder. Rebecca sat frozen in her chair, staring at me as if I'd transformed into someone completely unfamiliar. The silence stretched on as they absorbed the legal reality of what they were seeing, the official confirmation that their understanding of grandfather's will had been fundamentally incomplete. But why? My mother asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would he keep this secret? Why would he let us believe that Rebecca had inherited everything? Because, I said, standing and walking to the window that overlooked the lake, he wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing. He wanted to understand whether your affection for me was genuine, or whether it was conditional on my access to family money. I turned back to face them, noting the stricken expressions on their faces as they began to grasp the implications of what I was saying. Grandfather was a very astute observer of human nature, I continued. He understood that some people are motivated by genuine love, and others are motivated by financial self-interest. He designed his estate distribution to reveal which category each family member fell into. Rebecca found her voice, though it was shaky and uncertain. Sarah, you have to understand, we never meant to hurt you. We thought we were doing what grandfather wanted, following his wishes about the family business. You were following his wishes, I agreed. The public will was exactly what he intended you to see and follow. But it was also a test, one that revealed everything he needed to know about your priorities and your values. My father was still staring at the legal documents, his business mind struggling to process the financial implications of what he was reading. This property is worth millions, he said. The business projections show annual revenues of over $2 million. Sarah, this is a substantial enterprise. It is, I confirmed, and it's been operating successfully for 3 months now. We're booked solid through the end of the year. We've received recognition from major environmental organizations, and we're already being featured in travel publications as one of the premier ecotourism destinations in the Pacific Northwest. I walked back to my chair and sat down, looking at each of them with the calm confidence that came from knowing that I held all the cards in whatever conversation was about to unfold. So, I said, now we come to the question of your wedding reception application. You've submitted a request to book the lodge for Rebecca's wedding, and as the owner, I need to make a decision about whether to approve that booking. Rebecca leaned forward desperately. Sarah, please, I know we made mistakes, I know we didn't handle things well, but this is my wedding. This is the most important day of my life, and I've already told everyone about the venue. I understand how important this is to you, I said. The question is whether you understand how important it was to me when you dismissed me from the family legacy without a second thought. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I could see them struggling to find a response that might repair the damage they'd done, while still securing what they wanted from me. We can pay any fee you require, my father said, apparently defaulting to the kind of transactional thinking that had served him well in business, but which was completely inadequate for addressing the emotional and moral dimensions of our family dynamic. This isn't about money, I said quietly. It never was about money, it was about respect, and inclusion, and being valued for who I am, rather than being dismissed for who I'm not. My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Sarah, we're so sorry, we never realized what we were doing to you, how much we were hurting you. Please tell us how to make this right. I sat back in my chair, looking around the room that grandfather had built as his private retreat, thinking about the business plans he'd developed, and the letter he'd written explaining his hopes for my future. The lodge represented more than financial success, or even professional achievement. It represented the possibility of living according to my own values, of building something that mattered, of proving that worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition or approval. I'll approve your application, I said finally, and the relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. But I have conditions. Rebecca nodded frantically. Anything, whatever you want. First, I said, the reception will be planned and executed according to our standard environmental protocols. No exceptions, no special accommodations that compromise our sustainability commitments. You'll work with our staff to ensure that every aspect of the event aligns with our mission and values. Of course, Rebecca agreed immediately. Second, I continued, the reception will include a presentation about the lodge's environmental education programs and our work with local conservation organizations. Your guests will learn about sustainable tourism and the importance of protecting wilderness areas like this one. My father looked less enthusiastic about this condition, but he nodded his agreement. Third, I said, you'll
pay our standard wedding package fee with no family discount and no special financial arrangements. This is a business transaction, and it will be conducted according to normal business practices. That's perfectly fair, my mother said quickly. And finally, I said, standing up and walking to the window again, you'll acknowledge publicly that this property belongs to me, that I built this business, and that your access to this venue is the result of my success rather than your connections or your social status. The room was quiet as they absorbed this final condition, understanding that it would require them to admit their mistake, not just privately, but in front of the 200 guests who would attend the reception. Sarah, Rebecca said slowly, are you saying that you want us to tell our wedding guests that we were wrong about you? That we underestimated you? I'm saying that I want you to tell the truth, I replied. The truth about grandfather's real intentions, the truth about my inheritance, the truth about what I've accomplished while you've been celebrating what you thought was my marginalization. Victoria Chen, who had been sitting quietly during this exchange, spoke up for the first time. If it helps, she said, I can provide documentation of the timeline, showing when the codicil was executed and when the property transfer took place. The legal record will make it clear that Miss Mitchell's inheritance was always part of your grandfather's plan. My family looked at each other, engaging in one of those silent conversations that long-married couples and close siblings can have without words. I could see them weighing their desire for the prestigious venue against their reluctance to publicly acknowledge their mistake, calculating whether the social benefit of the lodge reception was worth the social cost of admitting they'd been wrong about me. We accept your conditions, my father said finally. All of them. Rebecca nodded, though tears were streaming down her face. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything we said, everything we assumed, everything we did wrong. You deserved so much better from us. Yes, I said simply. I did. The conversation that followed was long and emotional, filled with apologies and explanations and attempts to understand how our family relationships had become so distorted by assumptions about money and worth. My parents expressed genuine remorse for their treatment of me, and Rebecca acknowledged that her sense of entitlement had blinded her to my actual capabilities and achievements. But more importantly, they began to grasp the broader lesson that grandfather had been trying to teach them through his unconventional estate planning. Success wasn't about inheriting wealth or maintaining social position, it was about building something meaningful and lasting according to your own values and vision. Family relationships shouldn't be conditional on financial status or social approval, they should be based on genuine affection and mutual respect. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the lake and through the windows of the lodge, I found myself thinking about forgiveness and second chances, about the difference between punishment and education. My family had made serious mistakes in their understanding of me and their treatment of me, but they were also capable of learning from those mistakes and building better relationships based on more authentic appreciation for each other. The wedding reception, when it took place 6 weeks later, was everything Rebecca had dreamed it would be and more. The lodge provided a spectacular setting for the celebration, and our staff ensured that every detail was executed flawlessly while maintaining our environmental standards. But the most memorable moment of the evening came during the toasts, when my father stood before the assembled guests and told the story of grandfather's secret inheritance and my transformation of the mountain property into a successful business. 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the great room, we thought we understood our family's legacy and our individual roles within it. We were wrong. Sarah Mitchell has built something here that exceeds anything the rest of us have accomplished, and she's done it by staying true to values that our father taught but that we'd somehow forgotten along the way. The applause was long and heartfelt, and when it died down, Rebecca took the microphone to add her own tribute. My sister, she said, looking directly at me, taught me that worth isn't something you inherit, it's something you create. This beautiful place, this successful business, this example of environmental stewardship, all of it exists because Sarah had the vision and the determination to build something meaningful rather than just accepting what other people thought she deserved. As I listened to their words and felt the genuine warmth of their appreciation, I realized that grandfather's plan had worked exactly as he'd intended. The inheritance hadn't just given me financial security and professional opportunity, it had given me the tools to transform my family relationships from something conditional and transactional into something authentic and lasting. Standing on the deck of the lodge later that evening, watching the last of the wedding guests depart, and listening to the quiet sounds of the mountain night, I found myself thinking about legacy and inheritance, about the difference between what we're given and what we make of those gifts. Grandfather had left me more than property and money, he'd left me the opportunity to discover what I was truly capable of achieving when I had the resources and freedom to pursue my own vision. The Cascade Mountain Lodge was thriving, but it was only the beginning of what I hoped to accomplish. I had plans for expanding our educational programs, developing additional sustainable tourism properties, and creating a network of conservation-focused businesses that could serve as models for environmentally responsible economic development. The inheritance had given me the foundation, but the empire I was building would be entirely my own creation. My family's celebration of their supposed victory over me had lasted exactly 3 months. My celebration of what I'd actually accomplished was just getting started, and it was going to last for the rest of my life. The months following Rebecca's wedding marked a period of extraordinary growth, both for the Cascade Mountain Lodge and for my evolving understanding of what it meant to build a lasting legacy. The reception had been more than just a successful event, it had become a showcase for everything we'd accomplished, attracting the attention of environmental organizations, sustainable tourism experts, and investors who were interested in supporting similar projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. The publicity generated by the wedding had an immediate impact on our booking schedule. Within 2 weeks of the reception, we received inquiries from 3 major corporations wanting to hold executive retreats at the lodge, 2 universities interested in developing field study programs, and a documentary production company that wanted to feature our operation in a film about innovative approaches to conservation. The phone in my office rang constantly, and my email inbox filled with requests for information about our programs, our availability, and our expansion plans. More significantly, the wedding had fundamentally altered my relationship with my family in ways that went far beyond their newfound respect for my business acumen. The public acknowledgement of my achievements had forced them to confront their own assumptions about success, family loyalty, and the difference between inherited privilege and earned accomplishment. The conversations that followed were sometimes difficult, but they were also more honest and substantive than any we'd had in years. My mother began visiting the lodge regularly, not as a customer but as someone genuinely interested in understanding what I'd built and why it mattered. She spent hours walking the trails, observing the wildlife, and asking detailed questions about our conservation programs. Her transformation was perhaps the most surprising, as she gradually shifted from someone primarily concerned with social appearances to someone genuinely committed to environmental causes. "I never understood what you were passionate about," she admitted during one of these visits, as we sat by the lake watching a family of osprey fish in the shallow water near the shore. "I thought your environmental science degree was just a phase, something you'd outgrow once you settled into a more practical career. I see now that I was wrong about what constitutes a practical career." The conversations with my father were more complex, colored by his struggle to understand how I'd managed to build something that exceeded his own business achievements while operating according to principles that seemed to contradict everything he'd learned about maximizing profit and market dominance. He spent considerable time reviewing our financial statements and business projections, trying to reconcile our success with our commitment to environmental sustainability and community benefit. "The numbers don't make sense according to traditional business models," he said during one particularly intense discussion about our pricing strategy and customer selection criteria. "You're leaving money on the table by refusing to maximize occupancy rates, and you're spending more on environmental compliance than you need to by legal standards. Yet somehow you're generating higher profit margins than most hospitality businesses." That's because we're not just a hospitality business, I explained. We're selling transformation experiences, environmental education, and access to something that can't be replicated or mass-produced. People pay premium prices for authenticity and meaning, not just for luxury amenities. The concept of selling meaning rather than just services was foreign to his understanding of business, but he was intelligent enough to recognize that our success validated the approach regardless of whether he could fully comprehend the underlying principles. Over time, he began asking questions about sustainable business practices and investigating how some of these ideas might be applied to the family's automotive dealerships. Rebecca's relationship with me underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The sister who had once dismissed me as an irrelevant disappointment became one of my most enthusiastic supporters and advocates. She joined our board of advisors, helping to develop marketing strategies that would attract environmentally conscious customers while maintaining our commitment to educational programming. Her social connections, which had once been used to exclude me from family activities, became valuable assets for promoting our mission and expanding our network of supporters. "I want to help you build something even bigger than what you've already accomplished," she said during one of our planning sessions. What happened at my wedding reception made me realize that I'd been thinking too small about what was possible, not just for you but for all of us. This lodge is just the beginning of what could become a completely new model for how businesses can contribute to environmental conservation. Her enthusiasm was genuine, but it also reflected a deeper understanding of what she'd lost during the years when she'd dismissed my potential. The inheritance drama had cost her more than just the opportunity to maintain a relationship with me, it had cost her the chance to be part of something truly innovative and meaningful from the beginning. She was determined not to make the same mistake twice. The success of the lodge had also attracted attention from investors and environmental organizations who were interested in supporting similar projects. Within 6 months of the wedding, I'd received serious inquiries from 3 different groups who wanted to provide funding for expansion, either at the existing property or at additional locations throughout the region. The proposals ranged from modest expansions of our current facilities to ambitious plans for developing a network of eco-tourism destinations that could serve as models for sustainable development across the entire Pacific Northwest. The most intriguing proposal came from a partnership between the Sierra Club and a group of impact investors who specialized in environmentally beneficial business ventures. They wanted to provide funding for developing 5 additional properties over the next 10 years, each one designed to showcase different aspects of environmental conservation while generating revenue that could support ongoing research and education programs. "We see the Cascade Mountain Lodge as proof of concept for something much larger," explained Dr. Margaret Hayes, the Sierra Club's regional director for sustainable tourism initiatives, during a presentation at our conference facility. "You've demonstrated that it's possible to operate a profitable business while actually improving rather than degrading the natural environment. Now we want to help you scale that model to have regional and eventually national impact." The financial terms of their proposal were generous, but more importantly, the partnership would provide access to scientific expertise, educational resources, and marketing networks that could accelerate our growth while maintaining our commitment to environmental principles. The collaboration would also give us the credibility and institutional support needed to influence policy discussions about sustainable tourism and conservation funding. As I considered these various expansion opportunities, I found myself returning again and again to the letter grandfather had left for me, particularly his thoughts about building something that would outlast both of us and contribute to positive change in the world. The lodge had exceeded even his most optimistic projections, but I sensed that he would have encouraged me to think even bigger about what was possible. The decision to pursue the Sierra Club partnership came after months of careful consideration and extensive discussions with Victoria Chen about the legal and financial implications of the collaboration. The partnership structure would allow me to maintain majority control of all properties while accessing the resources needed for responsible expansion. More importantly, it would ensure that any additional properties developed under the partnership would be permanently protected from future development that might compromise their environmental integrity. "Your grandfather would be proud," Victoria said as we finalized the partnership agreements. "He always believed that the best business ventures were the ones that created value for multiple stakeholders, rather than just extracting profit for shareholders."
This partnership embodies exactly that kind of thinking. The first new property under the partnership was a degraded timber site about 2 hours north of Portland that had been clear-cut decades earlier and never properly restored. The previous owners had gone bankrupt trying to develop it for conventional tourism, leaving behind a scarred landscape and several abandoned buildings that would need to be either renovated or demolished. The transformation of this property into the Cascade River Retreat became a showcase for ecological restoration techniques and sustainable building practices. Working with forestry experts from Oregon State University, we developed a comprehensive reforestation plan that would restore native species while creating recreational opportunities for visitors. The existing buildings were renovated using reclaimed materials and renewable energy systems, creating accommodations that were both comfortable and environmentally responsible. The restoration project attracted national attention from environmental organizations and sustainable development advocates. We were featured in articles in National Geographic, Outside Magazine, and Architectural Digest, each one highlighting different aspects of our approach to combining luxury hospitality with ecological restoration. The publicity generated by these articles led to speaking engagements at environmental conferences and invitations to serve on advisory boards for other conservation organizations. More importantly, the success of the restoration project demonstrated that environmental damage could be reversed through careful planning and sustained effort. The property that had been an ecological disaster area when we acquired it was transformed within 18 months into a thriving ecosystem that supported dozens of species of birds, mammals, and native plants. The before and after photographs became powerful tools for educating visitors about the potential for positive environmental change. The educational programs we developed at both properties began attracting students and researchers from universities throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. We established partnerships with environmental science programs at 6 different universities, providing field research opportunities for graduate students while contributing to scientific understanding of ecosystem restoration and sustainable tourism practices. Dr. James Morrison, a forest ecology professor from the University of Washington, became a regular collaborator and eventually joined our scientific advisory board. "What you've created here goes far beyond tourism," he explained during one of his visits. "These properties are becoming living laboratories for testing innovative approaches to conservation and restoration. The research being conducted here has implications for environmental management practices throughout the region." The combination of business success, environmental impact, and educational value had created something that transcended the original vision I'd developed when I first inherited the mountain lodge. What had begun as a single ecotourism property had evolved into a comprehensive model for how private enterprise could contribute to environmental conservation while generating sustainable revenue and providing meaningful employment for local communities. The employment aspect became particularly important as we expanded our operations. Each new property created jobs for local residents, but we were careful to ensure that these were high-quality positions that provided living wages and opportunities for professional development. Many of our employees were people who had struggled to find work in rural communities where traditional industries like logging and mining were declining, and we took pride in providing them with careers that aligned with environmental stewardship rather than resource extraction. Maria Santos, who started as a housekeeper at the original lodge and eventually became our director of operations, exemplified the kind of career development we tried to foster. She'd been working part-time jobs in the nearby town when we first opened, struggling to support her family after her husband was laid off from the local lumber mill. Within 2 years, she'd completed our management training program and taken on responsibilities that included staff scheduling, guest services coordination, and facility maintenance oversight. "This job gave me more than just a paycheck," she explained during a staff meeting where we were discussing expansion plans. "It gave me a career that I can be proud of, something that contributes to protecting the environment instead of destroying it. My kids are growing up understanding that work can be about more than just making money." The transformation of our employees' relationships with their work reflected the broader impact our operations were having on the communities where we operated. Rather than extracting resources or exploiting cheap labor, we were investing in local economies while building something that enhanced rather than degraded the natural and social environment. As our third anniversary approached, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with that devastating will reading in grandfather's study. The inheritance that my family had dismissed as insignificant had become the foundation for an enterprise that was generating millions of dollars in annual revenue while contributing to environmental conservation, scientific research, and community development. The financial success was gratifying, but it was secondary to the sense of purpose and accomplishment that came from building something that mattered. Every morning when I woke up in the master suite of the original lodge, looking out at the lake surrounded by forest that we were actively protecting and restoring, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your values while making a positive difference in the world. My family's understanding of success had been fundamentally altered by witnessing what I'd accomplished. The conversations during our regular family dinners at the lodge had evolved from discussions of profit margins and social positioning to conversations about environmental policy, conservation strategies, and the role that businesses could play in addressing climate change and habitat loss. "You've taught us that there are different ways to measure success," my father admitted during one of these dinners, as we sat around the massive dining table in the main lodge. "I spent my entire career focused on maximizing short-term profits, and I thought that was the only way to build a sustainable business. Watching what you've accomplished has made me realize that some of the most successful businesses are the ones that prioritize long-term value creation over immediate financial returns." The recognition from my family was meaningful, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of self-worth or professional satisfaction. The inheritance had given me something more valuable than their approval. It had given me the opportunity to discover what I was capable of achieving when I had the resources and freedom to pursue my own vision without compromise. The fourth property in our network opened just before the fourth anniversary of that fateful will reading, and the opening celebration became an opportunity to reflect on how dramatically our circumstances had changed. The event was attended by environmental leaders, government officials, university researchers, and business executives who were interested in learning about our approach to sustainable development. Governor Patricia Williams delivered the keynote address, praising our operations as a model for how private enterprise could contribute to the state's environmental and economic goals. "The Cascade Conservation Network," she said, referring to the formal name we'd adopted for our collection of properties, "demonstrates that environmental protection and economic development are not competing priorities but complementary strategies that can reinforce each other when implemented thoughtfully." The governor's recognition was followed by announcements of two major expansions: a partnership with the National Park Service to develop educational programs at several national parks, and a collaboration with the United Nations Environment Program to create a training center for sustainable tourism professionals from developing countries. As I listened to the speeches and watched the faces of the people who had gathered to celebrate our achievements, I found myself thinking about legacy and inheritance in ways that went far beyond financial assets or property ownership. Grandfather's real gift hadn't been the mountain lodge or the trust fund, valuable as those resources had been. His real gift had been the opportunity to build something that would contribute to positive change long after I was gone. The business empire I'd created would eventually be passed on to others, just as grandfather's automotive business had been passed on to my family. But the impact of what we'd built, the environmental restoration we'd accomplished, the educational programs we'd developed, and the model we'd created for sustainable business practices, would continue generating benefits for decades or even centuries to come. Standing on the deck of the original lodge, later that evening, after the last of the celebration guests had departed, I looked out at the lake that reflected the stars above, and listened to the sounds of the forest that we'd helped protect and restore. The silence was profound and peaceful, broken only by the occasional call of an owl, or the distant splash of a beaver in the lake. The inheritance that my family had dismissed as insignificant had become the foundation for something that exceeded anything they could have imagined. But more than that, it had become proof that worth and legacy weren't determined by other people's recognition or approval, but by the impact you had on the world, and the values you embodied in everything you built. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my peaceful contemplation. It was from Rebecca, sent from Portland, where she was attending a business conference with my father. "Saw an article about your UN partnership in tomorrow's Wall Street Journal," the message read. "Dad is beside himself with pride, and I'm already planning my next visit to see the new property. You've built something incredible, and I'm so grateful to be part of it. The gratitude in her message was genuine, reflecting the authentic relationship we'd developed since the revelation of the codicil. But reading it, I realized that I no longer needed their gratitude or pride, any more than I'd needed their dismissal or disapproval. The inheritance had taught me that the most important validation came from within, from the knowledge that you'd used your opportunities and resources to create something meaningful and lasting. The Cascade Conservation Network would continue growing and evolving long after I was gone, contributing to environmental protection and sustainable development in ways that would benefit countless future generations. That legacy, built on the foundation of grandfather's secret gift but expanded through my own vision and determination, was worth more than any traditional inheritance could ever be. As I walked back inside the lodge and prepared for another night in the mountains that had become my true home, I found myself smiling at the thought of that devastating afternoon in grandfather's study when my family had celebrated what they thought was their complete victory over me. They'd gotten exactly what they'd asked for, but they'd never imagined that what I'd received would prove to be infinitely more valuable than anything they'd claimed for themselves. The codicil they'd missed had changed everything, but not in the way any of us had expected. It hadn't just redistributed wealth or corrected an unfair inheritance, it had revealed the difference between inheriting success and creating it, between claiming a legacy and building one, between demanding respect and earning it through accomplishments that spoke for themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new properties to develop, and new programs to launch. The work would never be finished, the impact would continue growing, and the legacy would outlast all of us. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, building exactly what the world needed. The codicil had been more than a legal document, it had been a roadmap to a life worth living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.